Just 2 days after the happiest moment of his life, 26-year-old Daniel Parker was found dead in his hotel room. The newlywed had just married 55-year-old Evelyn Harris, a wealthy woman known by many in their small town. It was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter for both of them, but instead of celebrating a honeymoon, police were investigating a murder. The case immediately sparked questions. Why would anyone want to kill Daniel just after his wedding? Was it a robbery gone wrong? Or was there something more sinister hiding in their seemingly perfect marriage? As investigators looked closer, strange details began to surface. Daniel's body showed signs of a struggle, but there were no signs of forced entry into the hotel room. And while Evelyn claimed she had no idea what happened, people began to wonder, could this have been more than a tragic accident? This story takes us deep into the lives of two people from very different worlds, connected by love and separated by death. The truth behind Daniel Parker's murder would leave everyone shocked, with secrets about money, betrayal, and jealousy coming to light. Now let's dive into the full story of what really happened to Daniel Parker just 2 days after he said "I do." Daniel Parker was 26 years old, full of energy, and always hopeful about his future. He had big dreams and was liked by many people around him. He wasn't rich, but that didn't stop him from wanting to build a good life for himself. Daniel had always wanted to find love and settle down, which is when he met Evelyn Harris. Evelyn was 55, a widow, and a woman with lots of money. She lived in a small town where everyone knew each other, and people respected her because she had lost her first husband years ago. When news spread that Evelyn was dating Daniel, people in town began to talk. They wondered if Daniel really loved her or if he was after her money. Despite all the gossip, Daniel and Evelyn decided to marry. Their wedding was quiet, with only close friends and family attending. The ceremony was simple, and for the most part, it seemed like a happy day. But even at the wedding, some people noticed that Daniel and Evelyn didn't look like a typical newlywed couple. There wasn't much joy or excitement between them, and this left some guests feeling uneasy. 2 days after their wedding, tragedy struck. Daniel was found dead in their hotel room, where they had been staying for their honeymoon. He had been strangled, and there were signs that he had fought back. His death was violent and unexpected, shocking everyone who knew him. What made the case even stranger was that there were no signs of forced entry, nothing was stolen, and no one had broken in. The police quickly ruled out the idea that this was a random crime. It seemed like someone who knew Daniel had killed him. When the town heard about Daniel's murder, people couldn't believe it. How could this young man, with his whole life ahead of him, be killed so brutally just 2 days after his wedding? The police started investigating immediately, and their first suspect was Evelyn. She was the one who had found Daniel's body, and since they were sharing the same hotel suite, it made sense to question her first. Evelyn told the police that she had been in another room when Daniel was killed. She claimed she didn't hear or see anything unusual. But the detectives found her story strange. How could someone be so close and not hear a thing? As they began digging deeper into their relationship, the police started to wonder if this marriage had more secrets than anyone knew. The investigation into Daniel's murder began slowly but surely. The police first interviewed the hotel staff, asking them if they had noticed anything unusual. Several employees mentioned that Daniel and Evelyn didn't act like a happy couple. While most newlyweds are full of joy, excited about their new life together, Daniel and Evelyn seemed distant. They barely spent time together, and when they did, they looked more like strangers than a married couple. This made the detectives curious. Why wasn't there more happiness between the two? The police also began looking into Daniel's life. They talked to his friends and family, trying to find out if anyone had a reason to hurt him. But no one could think of any enemies Daniel might have had. He wasn't involved in anything illegal or dangerous, and he didn't owe anyone money. He was just a regular guy trying to make a life for himself. However, one of Daniel's close friends shared something that caught the detectives' attention. Right before the wedding, Daniel had told his friend that he was starting to have doubts about marrying Evelyn. He wasn't sure if she truly loved him, and this left him feeling unsure about the whole marriage. This piece of information made the detectives take a closer look at Evelyn. As they began digging into Evelyn's past, they found something strange. Years ago, Evelyn's first husband had died in an accident. At the time, his death was ruled as an unfortunate fall down the stairs, but now, with Daniel's murder fresh in their minds, the police started to wonder if there was more to that story. Was Evelyn somehow involved in her first husband's death too? The detectives decided to find out more. They spoke to people who knew Evelyn, hoping to get a better sense of who she really was. Some people described her as a kind woman who had been through a lot after losing her first husband. They said she was simply looking for love and happiness with Daniel. But others painted a darker picture. They said Evelyn was controlling and liked to get her way, often manipulating people around her. This raised more red flags for the investigators. Had Evelyn manipulated Daniel into marrying her for reasons other than love? The police also looked into Evelyn's finances, trying to see if there was any motive for Daniel's murder. That's when they made a shocking discovery. Just a few weeks before the wedding, Evelyn had convinced Daniel to sign a life insurance policy. The policy was worth a large sum of money, and Evelyn would receive it all if something happened to Daniel. This information made the detectives even more suspicious of Evelyn. Was this marriage really about love, or was it part of a plan to get Daniel out of the way? As the detectives pieced together more details, Evelyn's calm and collected demeanor seemed even more suspicious. The more they learned about her past, the more they believed that Daniel's murder was not an accident. It was beginning to look like something much darker, and the police were getting closer to uncovering the truth. As the detectives peeled back the layers of Evelyn's life, they began to uncover disturbing details that sent shockwaves through the investigation. One of the most significant discoveries was the life insurance policy that Evelyn had convinced Daniel to sign just weeks before their wedding. The detectives were stunned when they realized the size of the payout: millions of dollars. Evelyn stood to inherit an enormous sum of money in the event of Daniel's death. This was no ordinary insurance policy. This was a financial safety net that would ensure Evelyn's continued wealth for the rest of her life. The timing of the policy, so close to the wedding, raised immediate suspicions. Why would Evelyn push for such a large policy just before they were married? The detectives couldn't shake the feeling that this was no coincidence, but rather part of a well-thought-out plan. The life insurance policy shifted the investigation's focus entirely. What initially seemed like a tragic murder with unclear motives now appeared to have a clear financial incentive behind it. The detectives began to wonder if Evelyn had been plotting Daniel's murder long before they exchanged vows. Had she lured him into a marriage for love, or was it all about the money? These questions weighed heavily on the minds of the investigators as they dove deeper into Evelyn's personal life. But it wasn't just the life insurance policy that raised red flags. As the police interviewed the hotel staff and those who had been around Evelyn in the days leading up to Daniel's death, they noticed a pattern of odd behavior. Hotel employees mentioned that Evelyn seemed unusually secretive, often isolating herself from Daniel and spending long periods on her phone. They noticed that whenever Evelyn was on the phone, she would speak in hushed tones, as if she didn't want anyone to overhear her conversations. This struck the detectives as odd. Who was she talking to, and why was she so intent on keeping those conversations private? The detectives wasted no time in requesting Evelyn's phone records, hoping they would provide some answers. When they reviewed the records, they discovered something that made the case even more suspicious. Evelyn had been in regular contact with a man named Greg, an old friend of hers. At first glance, Greg didn't seem particularly important, but when the detectives looked into his background, they found a much darker side to him. Greg had a shady past with a history of involvement in criminal activities. Although he had never been convicted of any major crimes, his name had come up several times in connection with various illegal schemes. His presence in Evelyn's life at such a critical time raised serious concerns for the investigators. Greg became a person of interest almost immediately. The detectives began to suspect that Evelyn and Greg were more than just old friends catching up. The frequent phone calls between the two in the days leading up to Daniel's murder were far too coincidental to ignore. As they pieced together the timeline, a disturbing theory began to emerge. What if Evelyn and Greg had been working together to orchestrate Daniel's murder? The life insurance policy, the secretive phone calls, and Greg's criminal background all pointed towards something far more sinister than anyone had initially imagined. The detectives began building a case around the idea that this wasn't just a crime of passion or a sudden act of violence. This was beginning to look like a cold, calculated plan, one designed to get rid of Daniel and allow Evelyn to collect a massive financial windfall, but they needed more evidence to prove it. They decided to bring Evelyn in for further questioning, hoping to push her into revealing more about her relationship with Greg. When the detectives confronted Evelyn with their suspicions, she remained calm, almost too calm. She downplayed her relationship with Greg, insisting that they were just old friends who had kept in touch over the years. She claimed that Greg had absolutely nothing to do with Daniel's death and that their phone calls had been about personal matters unrelated to the murder. But the detectives weren't convinced. Evelyn's responses were too rehearsed, too calculated. She seemed to be carefully choosing her words, as if she was trying to hide something. The more they questioned her, the more her story began to fall apart. The detectives continued to dig into her phone records, her financial transactions, and any other evidence that could link her to a larger plot. With each new piece of information, Evelyn's involvement in Daniel's murder became more apparent. It was clear that she wasn't just a grieving widow, she was a suspect in a crime that was starting to look like a premeditated murder for financial gain. But to make their case airtight, the detectives needed more than just circumstantial evidence. They needed a confession or a direct link between Evelyn and the murder. That's when they turned their attention to Greg. If anyone knew the truth about what really happened to Daniel, it was him. With suspicions mounting against Evelyn and Greg, the detectives knew they needed to bring Greg in for questioning. They believed he held the key to unlocking the truth about Daniel's murder. When Greg was first brought into the police station, he was confident and calm, much like Evelyn had been during her initial questioning. He denied any involvement in the murder, claiming that his relationship with Evelyn was purely platonic and that they had only spoken about everyday things. Greg insisted that he knew nothing about Daniel's death and that he had nothing to hide. But the detectives weren't buying his story. They had already gathered enough evidence to suggest that Greg was more involved than he was letting on. The frequent phone calls between him and Evelyn, the timing of those calls, and his shady past all painted a very different picture. The detectives pressed him harder, challenging his version of events and pointing out the inconsistencies in his story. As the pressure mounted, Greg's confident demeanor began to crack. He realized that the detectives weren't going to back off, and the walls were closing in around him. After hours of intense questioning, Greg finally broke. He confessed that Evelyn had reached out to him several months before her wedding to Daniel. According to Greg, Evelyn had told him that she was having doubts about the marriage, and that Daniel wasn't the man she thought he was. But instead of simply leaving Daniel or calling off the wedding, Evelyn had a different plan in mind. She wanted Greg's help in getting rid of Daniel permanently. Greg claimed that Evelyn had been the mastermind behind the entire plot. She had convinced him to help her kill Daniel so that she could collect the life insurance money and move on with her life. Evelyn had framed the situation as if Daniel was a problem that needed to be solved, and she had promised Greg a share of the insurance payout if he helped her carry out the murder. Greg's confession was shocking, but it also confirmed what the detectives had suspected all along: this wasn't a random act of violence. It was a premeditated crime, carefully orchestrated by Evelyn with financial gain as the motive. With Greg's confession in hand, the detectives finally had the breakthrough they needed. They now had enough evidence to arrest Evelyn for Daniel's murder. But even as the net closed in around her, Evelyn continued to maintain her innocence. She claimed that Greg was lying, that he was trying to frame her to save himself. Evelyn insisted that she had loved Daniel and would never have hurt him. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. The life insurance policy, the phone calls with Greg, and now Greg's direct confession all pointed to her guilt. The detectives presented their findings to the prosecutor, and the case quickly went to trial. As the trial unfolded, more shocking details about the crime came to light. Greg took the stand and testified against Evelyn, providing a detailed account of how they had planned Daniel's murder together. He described how Evelyn had manipulated Daniel into marrying her, knowing all along that she intended to kill him for the insurance money. Greg told the jury how they had planned to make the murder look like a random attack, hoping that no one would suspect Evelyn's involvement. The jury listened intently as the prosecution laid out the case against Evelyn. They heard about the life insurance policy, which had been set up just weeks before the wedding. They learned about the secretive phone calls between Evelyn and Greg and how they had plotted the murder together. The evidence was damning, and it became clear that this was not a crime of passion or a sudden act of violence. It was a cold, calculated plan fueled by greed and deception. In the end, the jury had little doubt about Evelyn's guilt. After a short deliberation, they returned with a guilty verdict. Evelyn was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Daniel Parker, while Greg received a reduced sentence for his cooperation with the investigation. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, the weight of the crime sinking in for everyone involved. Evelyn, once a wealthy widow with everything at her disposal, had thrown it all away in a twisted plot for money. The story of Daniel Parker's murder sent shockwaves through the small town, leaving a lasting impact on those who knew him. What had started as a seemingly happy marriage had ended in betrayal and tragedy. For Daniel's friends and family, the pain of losing him was made even worse by the knowledge that his death had been carefully planned by the woman he had trusted. In the end, justice was served, but the scars left behind by Evelyn's actions would never fully heal. Evelyn Harris was found guilty of Daniel Parker's murder. After weeks of testimonies, evidence, and emotional moments in court, the jury delivered their verdict, and the judge sentenced Evelyn to life in prison without any chance of parole. For Evelyn, it was the final chapter in a life that had once been filled with wealth, influence, and respect. She had gone from being a rich and admired woman in the town to a convicted murderer, stripped of her freedom and any sense of the life she once knew. Greg, her partner in crime, also faced justice. Although he had been part of the plan, his decision to testify against Evelyn earned him a lighter sentence. He would spend time in prison, but not as long as Evelyn. The town was left in shock. This wasn't the kind of place where such crimes happened, and yet Daniel's death had shaken everything. People couldn't stop talking about it. How could such a terrible crime happen in their quiet community? It seemed impossible that someone like Evelyn, who had always been known as a successful and respected figure, could commit such a horrible act. The story quickly became the subject of every conversation at local cafes, grocery stores, and family dinners. It wasn't just the crime that shocked people, but the cold and calculated nature of it. Evelyn hadn't acted out of sudden anger or in the heat of a moment. She had planned this, thinking about every detail, all for money. Daniel's family and friends were left devastated. No amount of justice could bring Daniel back. His death was a loss they would never fully recover from. Daniel had been young, just 26, with his whole life ahead of him. He had dreams, ambitions, and the love and respect of everyone who knew him. To his friends, Daniel was the person you could always rely on, a man who was kind-hearted, full of life, and always ready to lend a hand. His family remembered him as a loving son and a caring brother, someone who brightened up their lives with his warmth and positivity. Losing Daniel in such a violent and sudden way was a blow that left a deep, permanent wound. The trial gave them some sense of closure. Seeing Evelyn and Greg behind bars meant that justice had been served, and there was a small comfort in knowing that those responsible for Daniel's death were being punished. But no trial or verdict could erase the pain of losing him. His family and friends would carry that grief for the rest of their lives. For them, Daniel's death was not just the end of a young man's life, but the loss of all the potential he had, the future he would never get to live. They couldn't help but wonder what his life could have been like if Evelyn had not come into it. The emotional weight of the trial had taken its toll on Daniel's loved ones. They had sat through long days in court, listening to the details of how Evelyn had manipulated Daniel, how she had convinced him to marry her, and how she had coldly planned his murder. It was heartbreaking to realize how much Daniel had trusted Evelyn, not knowing that she was setting him up for his death. The testimony from Greg, in particular, was hard for them to hear. He had confessed to being part of a plan that robbed Daniel of his life, all because Evelyn wanted to cash in on the life insurance. For Daniel's family, the knowledge that his love and trust had been betrayed so deeply was almost as painful as the loss itself. For Evelyn, the story ended in a very different way. She had once been admired in the town. People saw her as a wealthy and powerful woman, someone who had survived the loss of her first husband and built a life of comfort. She had a large, luxurious home, financial security, and a reputation that many envied. But behind that image of success, Evelyn was hiding darker ambitions. Her greed had led her to manipulate and deceive, and ultimately it was her desire for more money that destroyed her life. By convincing Daniel to marry her and then planning his murder, Evelyn had sealed her fate. The woman who once had everything now had nothing, no freedom, no reputation, and no future outside of a prison cell. She would live out the rest of her life behind bars, thinking about the choices she made. Evelyn's story became a cautionary tale in the town. People couldn't stop talking about how far she had fallen. She had once been the picture of wealth and influence, but now her name was spoken with disgust and pity. Her actions served as a reminder of how greed can destroy lives and how dangerous it is to let selfishness control your decisions. The town could never have imagined that someone like Evelyn, who seemed to have it all, could be capable of such evil. She became a symbol of how appearances can be deceiving, how someone who seems so put together on the outside can be hiding dangerous secrets on the inside. Even as time passed and life returned to normal in the town, Daniel's murder was not forgotten. People still spoke of it with shock, trying to make sense of how such a tragic and senseless crime could have happened. The image of Evelyn and Daniel's relationship, once seen as strange but harmless, now took on a darker meaning. Behind their public smiles and appearances, there had been lies, manipulation, and cold-blooded planning. The crime served as a reminder that even in the most peaceful of places, evil can lurk, and no one is truly safe from it. The town would never be the same, haunted by the memory of Daniel's death and the betrayal that led to it. For Daniel's loved ones, moving on was not easy. They continued to grieve for him, holding on to the good memories they had of him while struggling with the reality of how his life was taken. They visited his grave, brought flowers, and spent quiet moments remembering the man he was. His absence left a hole in their lives that nothing could fill. His friends missed the laughter and joy he had brought to their lives, and his family longed for the moments they would never get to share with him. Birthdays, holidays, and other milestones became painful reminders of the time they had lost with Daniel. His life had been cut short not by accident or illness, but by the greed and cruelty of someone he trusted. As the years went by, the town slowly returned to its routine, but the story of Daniel Parker and Evelyn Harris never truly faded. It became a part of the town's history, a story that was passed down and remembered. People would warn each other about the dangers of trusting the wrong person, about how even the most loving relationships can hide dark intentions. Daniel's story served as a reminder that love, when mixed with greed, can quickly turn into something deadly. It was a lesson that no one in the town would soon forget.